personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very, very special guest on the show, Katy Pusch. She is the lead director of product and integration at Cox 2M. Welcome, Katy.
Hello, Debbie. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is really going to be a fun episode. You and I have known each other, met a number of years ago. We had a chance to collaborate on some work stuff, which is great. And I just think what you're doing is really fascinating. I like your point of view. You know, you're a very smart executive woman, very technically skilled as well. And I would love for you to explain, first of all, kind of your journey into technology and what you're doing with Cox 2M.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'll give you a brief rundown of how I made it here to this point in time. I started out in data analytics. Actually, my undergrad degree is in economics. It's not in technology, it's in economics. And I started out trying to help companies make better decisions about their markets and their customers and how to support those. And so started out in data analytics, several years later transitioned into product management, but specifically for data science products. So that data thread has been with me throughout my career. So focusing on data science product management, and then finally moving into, now I lead the department of product and integration for IoT product management, which I really relate to IoT just being an additional data collection mechanism. Really, the core value that you want to deliver with IoT is also still data. And there are a lot of very interesting data management aspects associated with IoT in particular as a data source.
You're definitely a smart cookie, and I've enjoyed collaborating with you. I also love your point of view, because I think sometimes when people think about going into these emerging data or emerging technology areas, they're like, let's just develop products and put our blinders on and not think about, the risk, or not think about, other things. So I feel like you're very balanced in that way. It's like, yes, let's have technology innovation, but let's also consider all the other things that you need to think about when you're trying to develop a product, whether it's for a consumer or a business.
Absolutely. My very early career experiences were market intelligence and competitive intelligence as well, in terms of, creating the market strategy and competing against competitors. But there are some really clear ethical guidelines involved in competitive intelligence for anyone who's been in that space before. Do not lie being the golden rule, right? And that early experience of brushing up against ethics very early in my career, I think, was helpful, because I absolutely continue to view all of my business cases and market approaches through the lens of not only is this good for the company, but is this good for society? And to put that second question, I guess, a little bit more practically for companies, if this shows up in headlines, are we going to be embarrassed, or are we going to be proud? And that's sort of the litmus test that stayed with me throughout my career, that I think results in really good market strategies, really good product approaches, and keeps you on the right side of things where you want to be.
IoT is such a big space that can mean almost anything. But can you tell, just at a high level, the types of IoT stuff that you work on?
So absolutely, you're correct. There are so many different flavors of IoT. The IoT that I focus on at the moment is primarily asset management. So can I provide valuable information to companies about where their assets are located, the status of their assets, so that they can manage and track those assets more effectively? Primarily, the types of use cases that I'm thinking about, again, at the moment, are related to efficiency gains, right? Can we save money and operate more effectively as an organization? And of course, that results in downstream business impact of getting to market sooner, higher customer satisfaction, right? That really impacts the bottom line for our customers.
I read a statistic recently that said that most company that the average company has more IoT devices in their environment than they have computers. And I think that's kind of shocking. People don't really think about how many internet connected devices that they encounter when they're at work, even at home. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. It's less shocking to me, maybe, but I love that stat and I love bringing that awareness to people, especially if you think about it in terms of asset management, right? If I'm tracking inventory at my company that I intend to sell and right process through to send to market versus the number of computers that my employees are using. Well, I have much higher inventory than computers that my employees are using, right? And so the ratio sort of works out in that favor. We have many more pieces of equipment, I would say generally, in our organizations than we do people these days. So that, I mean, that metric is, I think, a great educational stat, but that makes a ton of sense to me in the world that I see. Cox Communications is a part of Cox Enterprise, Cox Automotive, and so we brush up against the automotive space a bit. And the same is true for vehicles, right? So if you think about asset tracking in terms of tracking vehicles, there are so many vehicles on the road, so many vehicles that businesses employ to help their employees be mobile and do their jobs more effectively. And there's so much data out there to assist in solving these questions and answering.
So, as you're working in kind of this emerging space with all this new technology, is there anything that you've come up against that's just really surprised you just hadn't thought about in the past? When you start working on these types of products?
I think about it a little bit in the context of the Gartner hype cycle, in the sense that I think anytime you're learning a new industry, you have this preconceived notion of what it could be, right? You're on that hype cycle of the peak of inflated expectations of, oh my gosh, this can like revolutionize the world. This was true for me with data science as well, right? When you get involved in the mechanics of data science and really solving problems with data science, and you realize that a lot of the fancier techniques there's fewer business cases that really require those really fancy advanced techniques. And so I think it's interesting to think about IoT in that same way of there are so many problems that IoT can solve. And in a lot of ways, right, we're on the forefront of revolutionizing. But I think any industry that you really get into the nuts and bolts of, you run into some common use cases that you want to solve problems with, and you develop a playbook, and then you learn how to improve the way that you deliver that playbook. And I think that's something that I continue to learn about each industry, is just that you can learn the patterns of the use cases and the business value that need to be delivered, and you continue to try to push the envelope of that, of course, but there's a set of value that you can deliver with 80%, right? 80% value, 20% effort. And then you continue to work on flavors of that. For IoT in particular, with asset management, I wouldn't say that it's shocking the amount of data that we can process to help solve problems. But it is a different experience actually being able to interact with that data and be involved in the really complex data pipelines that go from the embedded device to the network to the application layer, and how all of that needs to be processed in order to ultimately deliver value for a customer. Coming from previously a world of just software application development and data science related to that, a lot of the data you're gathering from software application management is either directly input by the user or collected through data streams, like if you think about something that you're doing with Twitter data or things like that, but it's still user generated data. And the scale of data and the complexity of pipelines for IoT is just immensely vaster. And so I enjoy talking about IoT to data science professionals because I think it's a really interesting industry to get into at the moment.
I really love this area. It definitely gets me excited because I love technology. I love kind of privacy data problems. So to me, this is really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Um, One thing I want to talk about, and this is something that I've talked to other people about, and we've seen some cases internationally about stuff like this. So for example, let's say a company had like a CCTV camera, right, that
Hmm.
they use in their business traditionally, and they decide they found a new one, right, that has some type of internet connectivity, it has some other type of analytics and different things that it does. And a lot of times what we're seeing with companies is that they're saying, okay, this is the newfangled thing, let's just install it and it'll be great. But now what they're not thinking about is that these more advanced tools are sort of collecting more data, is doing more things on the back end. So you really have to think about them differently. You have to sort of analyze and assess them differently. But what are your thoughts about kind of that switch for people?
Let me know if I'm answering the question that you intended or if I'm going in a bonkers direction. I In my opinion, disclosure is just the absolute most important thing about data privacy. And I think when you're dealing with an application layer and you're displaying data back to the user that they can see that clearly you've collected about their asset. So if you're tracking asset location and you're displaying that on a map in the application that the user sees, then of course that's disclosed. They realize that you're tracking the location of that asset. Um, but I think that it gets even more important with things that aren't as transparent as that, right? Not everything can be immediately put back into the display that the user is interacting with. And so there may be areas that are a bit more opaque in terms of what data is being collected and what's being done with it. So I think that finding ways to be transparent about data collection, what it's being used for, why it's being processed is very important. I think sometimes that can be done in the application. Sometimes it has to be done through privacy policies or training, right? In a B2B context, which is a lot of the space that I'm in right now. Training can play a huge role, especially with management and employees. But even more interesting, one more layer of abstraction is the different combinations of data and what insights are derived from that, right? If you process the messages coming from an IoT sensor in a different way, it can lead to different insights, right? If you apply a time scale, right, to certain position messages and you get a track of where things have been over time. So again, I just think there's so many different levels of abstraction. And if you adjust the data processing, then that is still another moment in time to reflect and say, has something meaningfully changed about the information we're gleaning from this data? And is that something we need to incorporate into our privacy policy or into our training or into our application directly? So I think continuous reflection on those questions and incorporating it into various methods of disclosure, depending on the situation, is what's really key to me.
Yeah. One case that came up in Australia last year is pretty popular. I think it was a 7-Eleven, I'm not sure. But basically, they had like a customer, it was like a feedback. Like they installed a tablet that gave people the capability to be able to do, rate store and different things like that. What they didn't tell people in a way that was legal in Australia was that this was, doing face captures. It was
Mm,
like, collecting their facial data, comparing it to certain databases and stuff like that. And so 7-Eleven was in hot water for this. And actually, there's another set of cases in Australia for like almost exactly the same thing. So I think this is kind of a ditch that companies are falling into where it's like, okay, maybe they were doing it some different way before. They found this newfangled technology way, but then I think there really has to be a lot of education with companies about how they use it because a lot of these tools have a lot more capabilities than they had before. So they have to really think through, am I, infringing on someone's right by using this tool in this way? And then too, I think also a lot of companies traditionally hadn't ever had to think about that. They thought, okay, if I collect data, it's mine. I can do whatever I want to with it. But now we're seeing these rights and these privacy laws and regulations be able to raise up and sort of giving people more of a stake in what's happening with their data. So what are your thoughts about that thing that's happening?
Oh gosh. I think a lot about human data interaction. And I don't have it right in front of me, so I'm gonna screw this up. But there are principles of data human interaction in terms of advancing rights that the user that the data is about should have with regards to their data. And at the lowest level, it's transparency, and that's largely where we're at. And then it advances to additional levels. One of those beyond transparency at the moment, for the most part, our choices as users is to completely opt out of the experience that is collecting the data or consent to the collection of data and the use of that data however the company sees fit effectively. And so where I would really like to see this industry proceed to, I mean, the industry broadly of data, right? All of data science is towards a model that allows more granular choices by users on how they can opt in and out of certain data uses. I think that there's a tendency for technology to want to move so quickly because of this premise that we're delivering value to businesses and to users. And so let's move quickly. We need to get it out to market. We need to be fastest to market. And I think there's a lot of value in moving quickly and iteratively. I also think there's a lot of value in being intentional with data use, especially in this field that is growing so rapidly, data science brushing up against AI and all of the very important implications of what an algorithm can do with your data outside of what was initially intended with the data collection. So I think that it's a very difficult problem to solve in terms of how to execute that consent and help users understand more granularly. Like, for instance, what I would love to see is if a company changes its privacy policy to incorporate additional sets of data that weren't previously used before, that a user can choose to continue using that experience under the previous privacy policy if they so choose. Now, this introduces a ton of governance headache and overhead for the companies administering these, right, in a way that could really inflate the cost of the solution downstream. So this is a very complex ecosystem of considerations, and I'm not trying to minimize that. But in my opinion, it's a very positive end goal to be striving for, not only transparency, but also more granular inputs from the user on how they want their data to be used as a result of this interaction. And if there are certain things they're okay with, but also if there are certain things that they want to continue to be able to engage with your product, but opt out of that element of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I call it incremental consent. So I think in the future, there's going to be a situation where based on what you're doing or how you're using something, it may be sort of a stopping point to say, hey, do you want to consent to this thing, this use or that use? So I think that's kind of where the technology has to go, especially as we're thinking about the metaverse and people, interacting with objects around them in maybe an augmented way. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that poses a particularly difficult challenge for some of it's kind of funny to call Google a legacy player, right? But their infrastructure has built up over decades at this point, right? And there have been reports, and I believe they've acknowledged as well to some extent. I'll have to look up the news reports on that. Speculation, sorry. I don't have it in front of me again, but they can't say with 100% confidence where the data has all been sent in their ecosystem, right? And I think that's very common for some of these legacy players that have been processing data for a long time before all of these considerations were really at the forefront of public discourse or even of, technical community discourse. And so it's a lot to untangle and go back from, but I think it's a really important problem to solve, especially as I think this is a really good space that the public sector has sort of lagged behind the private sector, because there's an opportunity for the public sector to learn and implement things even more successfully in some ways than the private sector has been able to. And so I really look forward to the continued implementation of these emerging technologies in the public sector, but in ways that reflect all of these more convoluted, let's say, right, interactions.
Yeah, I think just the way that technology has been built in the past is like, let's create a new bucket for everything, and let's
Mm.
take the data and replicate it into all these buckets, and then these buckets aren't made to be interoperable. They often aren't uh, uh, made in ways you can easily take the data out.
Right. Yeah.
Sort of a one-way in type of thing. So, and the world is changing where you have to know where this data goes, you know, who touches it, what you're doing with it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just, you know, we're trying to, you know, turn a battleship over on a dime in a way.
So there's a lot of love that data science gets in the industry, right? And I also love data science. It's amazing. Specifically within data science, though, I just want to say data engineers are the superheroes of the future, right? And that skill set of ensuring that we understand, well, I'm going to make it a combination of data engineering and data governance, right? We understand where this data originated. We can do some statistical analysis on how accurately we believe it reflects the population as a whole. We understand how it was processed to get from point A to point B, to point C to point D to point E, and all of the stops around the way, all of the processing that happened. I just think there's so much interesting and important work to be done in data governance and data engineering in particular. I think it's another one of those examples, though, of industry. The real important work is not often the flashy work, like I was talking about earlier about, you know, data science or IoT, but I have a lot of love and respect for data governance and data engineering professionals.
I agree. They do a lot of the hard work and the heavy lifting and thinking about these problems in different ways. You know, there's a recent case out of Illinois with Google Photos. A lot of companies get tripped up on this law in Illinois. It's the Biometric Information Privacy Act. And from being in Illinois and watching this over many years, actually, I've talked about this on PBS a couple of years ago about this law. I'm like, hey, you guys need to watch out for this. You're gonna be in trouble. This recent case, it has to do with Google Photos. So for a period of time, they were saying that Google may have used data of individuals that were in Google Photos over a period of time without. For BIPA, you have to let people know what you're collecting the data for and how long you're going to retain it. And the retention part is where a lot of companies trip up. I think that's probably what happened in this case. So I think I have a check coming from Google. I don't know. As a result of this, but because it is a class action and they do have to make a payout to people in Illinois. So what are your thoughts about this case?
I saw that as well, and I found it really interesting. Also, as an, you know, you mentioned the complexity of the state laws, and that was what you and I had, you know, part of what we had an opportunity to collaborate on recently was the differences in all of the state laws. I thought it was extremely interesting to find this case where I always kind of have this in the back of my mind of Google's probably using the data fairly indiscriminately. That's my just sort of personal consumer bias. I just have that suspicion, but it was still surprising to me to see that Google had used what I consider to be personal private information that I store on Google Photos to enhance biometric data face recognition, right? And that was certainly not maybe I needed to read into that data privacy really, really closely. But that certainly wasn't something that I would have expected Google to be doing with a private data set that in my mind, I own that data set and the service that they are providing is storing that data set for me, but certainly doesn't give them, again, in my mind as a private consumer, right, access to use that data for whatever they deem appropriate. So it was a really interesting case to me from that perspective, but also from the perspective of these complicated state laws that differ in so many ways, because if Illinois didn't have that law, then I, as a consumer, may have never found out that my data had been used that way. So I think from a business perspective, with my business hat on, it's sometimes frustrating that there are so many different state laws to try to comply with. It can really increase the complexity and the stress level with wanting to make sure that you're doing the right thing according to all of the different state laws, especially if you're operating in a national capacity. But from a consumer perspective, this was a case where I was pretty appreciative of this odd little law from Illinois, because it's the only reason that I became aware that something like that was happening. And I think that kind of awareness in different arenas, especially because it is an emerging space. And so there continue to be questions about which of these things are most important, what laws are going to be most effective in managing. The patchwork, I think, is really helpful. It's a helpful way to run, if I put it in business terms, iterative experiments almost on what types of cases does this cover? What types of behavior is this going to uncover that companies are engaging in? And I hope that over time, it's going to result in more of a consensus on what is most important and what laws really need to cover versus maybe handling outside of, literal legal methods. But I found it to be really intriguing for those reasons.
Well, I'm hoping that we come to, instead of going kind of the legalistic route, people come to more of a human-centered route and kind of think about it like, what would someone reasonably expect as a consumer? So if Katie gave her pictures to Google, does she reasonably expect that it will be used for some other purpose beyond just storing it, for your own purpose? You probably would say no, right?
Absolutely.
Most people will probably say no, because first of all, they don't know what it's being used for, and then they don't have any kind of ability to sort of opt out without kind of not using the service. So I think that those things are really important.
To build on actually a few things from our conversation, another layer of the human data interaction is actually compensation, if I recall correctly, right? And so that feels like a perfect combination of the incremental permissions that you were talking about, but also if I pay for a service, and then as a result of me paying for a service, then that company is going to take the data that I use in their service and make money off of it, right? Then that feels like a perfect opportunity to say, one, are you okay with this? And two, if you are okay with this, we're deriving value from using your data set. And so we're going to compensate you for that. And I would love to see that type of compensation come more to the forefront in terms of transparency as well. I'm always very suspicious of free applications, because if you're not paying, then you are the product is my thought. And I don't think I made that up. I think I read that somewhere originally. But I do believe that generally as a rule of thumb, right? If there is a free product, then they are getting value in some other way besides me paying for it. And what is that way? So very commonly it's through selling data, but I think there's an opportunity to be more transparent about that monetary flow as well, right? What is our business model? Is our business model to sell the data that you provide to us? And is there a way that you can pay us for our service to avoid us using your data in that way? And then you can still enjoy the service, right? I think there are just lots of options that haven't been fully explored yet.
I agree with that. I know I have friends in Europe, they are horrified about the whole data monetization thing. They say, oh, data shouldn't be sold. And it's like, well, data is sold, so let's not. It just is. So let's not pretend like it's not happening. But I think people should have more transparency as to what their data is worth and maybe they think a little bit harder about, maybe you reconsider the data that you give to people as a result of that. Yeah.
We haven't even talked about data brokers, an additional layer of complexity
Yeah.
of, right? If a company is selling data to a data broker, then what happens, right? It's not very well understood or tracked, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I know that regulations around the world in the US, they're really trying to focus on this third-party data transfer. So if a person gives you data for one reason, if you want to transfer it or use it for some other reason, they're trying to create mechanisms where there has to be some type of notification to a person. And in some places you have to like consent to that third party data sharing. So I'm hoping that process will bring a level of transparency so that people can say, no, I don't want you to sell, my data to these unnamed people that I don't know who they are and what they're going to do with this information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that is forthcoming. Data brokers keep me up at night.
Yeah, it's frightening. It's frightening how many there are, what they're doing with the data. Actually, let's talk about health. Let's talk about wearables.
Yeah.
So wearables is it's kind of a bit of a loophole in a way around kind of data broker, data collection stuff. Because I think people think if you have a wearable, especially if it's collecting this type of health information, people have a misconception that their data collection may be covered by HIPAA. And HIPAA in the US is basically a patient provider transaction. So if you're not in a patient provider situation, but you're giving out health information, it has a much lower level of protection. And those things are sort of up for grabs currently by whoever wants to share that information. So give me your thoughts about kind of wearables in this kind of gray area.
Absolutely. So wearables being part of IoT, certainly, and also extending to other type of health tracking applications. There's a lot of them, whether you want to track, personal goals related to fitness, or whether you're tracking a chronic condition that you have as a patient. If that is not, direct conversation with your healthcare provider, then exactly, I think about that as someone who's been active in the chronic care space for a little bit, right? There's a lot of implications about having data out there that is not governed by HIPAA, but that the users may have an unclear perspective on what rights they really have with regards to that data. I think about it a lot because I do think that there are ways to improve the patient experience, improve the quality of care delivered through applications that help patients manage their own care, through wearables that help patients monitor their own health. I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle as we think about how emerging technology can improve the lives of people, including in this case, patients and people managing their health. That's one area that, and you're the policy expert, right? So you can help tell me if you feel like, a policy or whether that human approach is the better approach. But especially when we think about startups who are bought and sold by different investors and go through many management hands, it feels like it's an opportunity to look for ways to apply some consistency to how that data is managed and ensure that the people tracking their health and trying to improve their lives are really aware of how that really sensitive sometimes data is being used.
Right, exactly. I mean, because what we're seeing is, data brokers taking this, they're creating like risk profiles of people based on what they either collected or things that they're inferring about individuals. In the US, we have the FTC has a rule about breach of security, which is basically supposed to handle this loophole, which is saying, okay, even though you're not covered by HIPAA, you should still, respect the fact that you have kind of personal health information about someone, and then you still have to kind of protect it in a certain way. The problem with that has been this rule hasn't been very well enforced, so it's been kind of a free for all. I think as a result of COVID and all these COVID apps that popped up that weren't sanctioned by any health provider or whatever, I think this really got on the radar at FTC, and I think they're going to try to start more enforcement in that area. But I think I hope that companies try to go more towards a human approach in terms of what they think is reasonable and what they should be doing with people's data. I don't think people expect if I wear a watch and I check my blood pressure, I don't expect that it's going to be sold to an insurance company or something.
Right. Absolutely. It reminds me of a study I read about GDPR, because GDPR came out and I was one of the people saying, yay, more privacy laws. And then I read this this report that really opened my eyes about how it really favored large companies and stifled innovation for some smaller companies that couldn't afford all of the analysis and trying to understand how to be compliant with the law. And so we just keep getting into the layers. Intellectually, for me, that's why the data privacy and data ethics space is so interesting, is because there are so many layers of complexity that you need to think about. And of course, innovation and allowing more value in products and services and healthy competition to make it into the market is a value of many people in the United States generally, I would say, right? We love innovation and startups and market competition. And it's a really complicated balance to try to make sure that the right things are in place to protect people while not unnecessarily stifling that innovation, right? And so that's just another layer. I think that startups can end up providing some really important value to people's lives more broadly. I don't want to say to our markets, right? To people's lives. They create products that can help improve the way that we navigate the world. But it's almost like that funding model even could be reevaluated in terms of what incentives we're driving, and are we encouraging looking at the human aspect versus looking at the return to investors solely. I would love in the startup space to see more sustainable growth paths instead of this emphasis on, the 10x unicorn. And I know that's the existing model, so maybe I should be careful. So,
well, I mean, I think that and we found in our work together, respecting privacy of individuals can be a business benefit.
Yes.
It could definitely be a driver because it creates less friction and creates less problem for a company that wants to use your tool. It lets them know that you're really thinking about that. And then as a consumer, if you have a choice, you're going to choose the one that's going to protect your data or protect your privacy.
How do you feel about all of this? And because I was thinking about this in the back of my head earlier, but what are your thoughts about decision fatigue and all of this, right? I think about all of the things that an average human has to make decisions about or think about deeply. And with all the transparency in the world, I sometimes worry how realistic it is that someone's not going to make it to their, decision fatigue limit for the day when it comes time to make a decision about whether they're okay with Google using their photos for biometric data or not.
Yeah, I think something should happen on this point. Decision fatigue is real. It's kind of psychological manipulation, in my opinion. So it's basically like, let's give this person 1,000 choices, so then they're going to just give up and they're going to say okay to everything, right? So that's what we're seeing with people who have, like you say, okay, accept all cookies, and then they have the other button say more choices. And you look at more choices, and it's so many that most people aren't going to do that. So to me, that's kind of a way to skirt, to pretend like you're complying with the law, but really not really, and sort of. Also, these 50, 80 page privacy policies, that's also a decision fatigue problem as well. So I think we need more simplification I'm like, let's have our privacy policies 1 page or something. Or
Yeah.
say, do you sell my data? Yes or no? Something very simple like that. So I think, it is in the best interest for companies to make it simple. And I think the ones that I've seen that have been very, very successful at getting more people like Apple. Like Apple's privacy policies are pretty simple, very simple actually. So you don't really need 80 pages of privacy policies. I don't think. I think that you need to make it very clear what you're doing with people's data, and then if they feel like it's a benefit, they'll give it to you, right? And they'll give you better data. So more data is not necessarily good data because people lie. They don't tell the truth about stuff, So a lot of the data that you think you're getting surreptitiously may be wrong and not at good quality. So I think the companies that have the trust of people and not have them go through this, this fatigue, decision fatigue model, they'll have better quality data and relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I
don't know. So if it were the world according to you, Katy, and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy, data science, IoT, anything, anywhere in the world?
It's a good question. And there are so many complicated layers that I have trouble answering it. I feel that I am an eternal student in this space, and I'm actually going back for a master's program to continue to explore this because there's so many different layers to untangle to advance this discourse. I think there's so much good work being done in all of the areas that we talked about really today, but those are all very sort of separate topic areas that can be investigated on their own. They all have interrelated complexities. If I want to say pie in the sky and sort of ignore those complexities for a moment, I would love for each user to understand what data is being collected, what the implications are to them as a human of that data being collected, right? How it could be used in different ways and how it actually is being used by the company collecting it. I would love to see that human data interaction paradigm be advanced, really. And I think a lot of what I continue to be a student of and look and learn about is, I think, we can always continue to optimize that human data interaction model, but also how do we advance on that continuum, right? There are so many factors that we get stuck in some of the easier steps, I feel like, as a society, right? And so how do we advance that more holistically is really what I want to see happen. Where users don't just have the opportunity to opt out, but really truly have more control over what's being done.
I agree with that. More agency.
Yes. Agency is the word I couldn't find in this whole conversation. Yes, agency.
That's what we need, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been fun. I've been excited that you were able to come on the show, and I look forward to us being able to do other fun things together in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was a blast.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you.